On June 9, 2027, the Vera Davenport Observatory, a newly commissioned orbital space telescope placed in deep Earth orbit, captured an image that would ripple through the scientific community for years to come. Designed as a multi-purpose observatory with capabilities exceeding those of the James Webb and Hubble combined, the telescope had begun its first operational cycle only 3 months prior. Its array of infrared, visible, and ultraviolet sensors had been used primarily to examine exoplanetary atmospheres, distant star nurseries, and gravitational lensing around galaxy clusters. Dr. Akari Thorne, an astrophysicist at the European Southern Observatory and one of the lead investigators on the Vera Davenport's Early Access Science program, had assigned her team a relatively routine target, Kepler 438c, a known exoplanet in the Lyra constellation, roughly 640 light-years from Earth. The planet had been categorized as potentially habitable based on size and orbital distance, but little beyond that had been confirmed. During a scheduled imaging sweep of the planet's surface using mid-infrared spectroscopy, a technician noticed a sharp reflection, unusual in its intensity and angular precision. Upon closer examination, the anomalous feature appeared to be a perfect ellipse nestled along the planet's equatorial region, stretching several kilometers across. Even more curiously, the elliptical object reflected in a way consistent with engineered curvature, not typical geological formations. It was flagged internally as Candidate 08 VL EQ reflective artifact. Dr. Thorne's team double-checked the data. There was no sensor malfunction, no cosmic ray interference. Multiple exposures taken over a 17-minute interval all showed the same anomaly. One set even captured what looked like faint linear structures radiating outward from the ellipse's edge, thin, almost architectural in appearance. Speculation erupted immediately within the internal communication channel. Suggestions ranged from a crater filled with water ice to a crystalline mountain range catching the planet's sun at just the right angle. But none of those explanations held under closer analysis. The reflectivity curve was too narrow. The alignment too precise. Martin Greaves, a systems engineer with the research team, is generally credited with making the discovery due to the single word written at the end of his initial report, telescope. That phrase was repeated in the summary report submitted to the Vera Davenport Oversight Committee later that week. While the word was intentionally couched in layers of scientific caution and uncertainty, it was there in plain text. The object resembled a large, concave, artificial structure positioned at a fixed equatorial location. The possibility, however remote, that it was a telescope, or something functionally similar, had to be considered. However, before further imaging could be done, the telescope's queue advanced. The Vera Davenport was operated on a strict international schedule. Observing time was divided among member nations and research institutions through a competitive application process years in advance. The next 3 weeks of the telescope's time had been awarded to a climate science group mapping high-altitude methane plumes on Titan. And per protocol, once a project had begun its observation window, it could not be interrupted unless there was a Level 1 anomaly, an emergency reclassification typically reserved for asteroid threats, solar flares, or direct threats to human life. The reflective artifact did not qualify. Frustration mounted among the discoverers. Back-channel emails were sent. Requests for time reallocation were denied. The only option was to wait. Meanwhile, the initial dataset, scrubbed of any personally identifiable information and watermarked with observational timestamps, was released to the greater scientific community per protocol. The news spread like wildfire, first in astrophysics communities, then all over the world. Mainstream media began referring to it inaccurately but irresistibly as the Eye. Debates raged between those who believed it to be evidence of extraterrestrial engineering and others who dismissed it as misinterpreted data or pareidolia magnified by confirmation bias. The public's imagination latched onto one idea. Humanity had finally built a telescope powerful enough to look across the void, and it had found something looking back. Within a week, petitions were launched to reassign the Vera Davenport schedule. Scientific bodies around the world began calling for a reassessment of observation priorities. The UN Subcommittee on Extraterrestrial Monitoring was convened for the first time in over a decade. And all the while, the Vera Davenport's camera pointed elsewhere, logging methane maps over Titan's surface. While a quiet, glittering shape waited in the Lyra constellation, silent, unresolved, and waiting. By June 19, 2027, 10 days after the discovery of the reflective artifact, internal disagreements within the scientific community had gone public. Several members of the Vera Davenport Oversight Committee held a press conference in Geneva to clarify that no formal conclusion had been reached regarding the nature of the mysterious object. They urged caution and patience. Anomalies are not discoveries, read one slide in the briefing, and hypotheses are not evidence. But the attempt at tempering expectations backfired. Within hours, international media outlets seized on the underlying tension. Why, they asked, was humanity not prioritizing further observation of what could be the first verifiable sign of extraterrestrial technology? Online forums speculated that governments were intentionally delaying follow-up observations to control the narrative. Conspiracy hashtags surged. Editorials accused the global scientific apparatus of being more loyal to protocol than to discovery. The phrase scheduled ignorance began trending. Behind the scenes, agencies scrambled to adapt. NASA, ESA, and the Chinese Space Agency jointly submitted a formal motion to the Vera Davenport Scheduling Board requesting an emergency rescheduling of upcoming observation windows. The Titan methane team, whose data collection was technically within protocol, agreed to pause their work for 48 hours if higher authorities intervened. But the board voted 6-4 to maintain the schedule. A tiebreaker was issued by the program's operations chief, citing insufficient justification to breach standing scientific contracts. In the absence of new images, speculation filled the vacuum. Several independent astronomers and AI modelers attempted to reconstruct 3D projections of the object using the publicly released data. These reconstructions varied widely in detail, but a few repeated features emerged. The object appeared to possess an inner ring of some kind, and faint grid-like striations on its surface. One model suggested the entire structure may be partially submerged or recessed into the ground, with only its convex curvature exposed. Dr. Eloise Zhang, a senior researcher at the Australian Centre for Astrobiology, published a widely circulated hypothesis proposing that the structure's reflective profile and orientation matched that of a parabolic reflector. Her model indicated the curvature would be consistent with an optical system capable of focusing electromagnetic radiation. If it's artificial, and if it is a telescope, she wrote, it's not passive. It's collecting something. Her conclusion sparked renewed interest, but also criticism. Several of her peers accused her of prematurely fueling speculation. Others accused the broader community of cowardice in refusing to explore possibilities that were, at the very least, mathematically consistent with engineered design. Meanwhile, outside the scientific sphere, the global public had already moved beyond caution. Television specials, podcasts, and YouTube documentaries proliferated. Some focused on the technical data, interviewing optics experts and planetary scientists. Others leaned toward the speculative, suggesting everything from dormant alien observatories to interstellar communication arrays. One theory posited that the object was a relay node, a watchtower placed deliberately to face Earth. Religious leaders made statements. Some denounced the object as a distraction from divine truth. Others embraced it as evidence of a greater cosmic design. A few even proposed that it was a mirror, built to show us ourselves. Across major cities, protests and vigils alike were held. Some called for truth. Others called for silence. By June 25, the United Nations Subcommittee on Extraterrestrial Monitoring had officially requested a closed-door briefing with the Vera Davenport mission leads. Their request was granted. Nothing from that meeting was released to the public. Internally, however, multiple agencies had begun quietly preparing. This included psychological response modeling, communication strategy workshops, and scenario planning simulations based on first encounter narratives. Some of these were drawn directly from science fiction literature, stripped of plot and rendered into actionable protocols. The telescope's queue continued, but within its control team, an unofficial directive had emerged: be ready. The moment Titan's scheduled imaging window closed, Vera Davenport would be pointed back toward Kepler 438c. A single 22-minute gap in the schedule, initially unclaimed, had been reassigned by quiet consensus. The object in Lyra would soon be seen again. By the final week of June, the eye had embedded itself in the collective consciousness of the planet. With no new images to confirm or deny the artifact's artificiality, it existed in a unique space, too real to ignore, too uncertain to explain. The ambiguity itself became the fuel. Every continent reported spikes in public interest, but also growing anxiety. News segments featured psychotherapists discussing existential vertigo, the sudden psychological disorientation caused by perceived shifts in humanity's place in the universe. Sales of philosophy books, religious texts, and apocalyptic fiction surged. Streaming platforms quietly noted record-breaking traffic for alien-themed documentaries and science fiction thrillers. Governments were not immune. Several national intelligence agencies began issuing quiet guidance to internal departments, advising against speculative commentary from public-facing scientists or officials. In some countries, these briefings went further, calling for monitoring of online discourse in the event that conspiracy narratives evolved into coordinated action. They didn't have to wait long. In Tokyo, a group of self-proclaimed signal sentinels gathered outside the National Institute for Communication Science, demanding the government acknowledge what they claimed was ongoing two-way communication between Earth and Kepler 438c. They carried signs marked with waveforms and binary sequences copied from unrelated SETI broadcasts, reinterpreted as messages. In São Paulo, a former radio engineer was hospitalized after dismantling a municipal tower and attempting to repurpose it into a homemade transmitter. He had published a 94-page document claiming to have received pulses of structured light through a security camera lens, pulses, he wrote, that carried messages of welcome, then warnings. He was not alone. Hospitals in several major cities began reporting a sharp uptick in admissions involving patients experiencing delusions, auditory hallucinations, or obsessive belief systems tied to the artifact. Psychiatrists across Europe and North America began to refer to the phenomenon informally as eye syndrome, not an officially recognized disorder, but a constellation of symptoms marked by obsession with the reflective artifact, belief in direct personal contact, and the sudden collapse of previously stable worldviews. Some patients claimed to have seen the object long before its discovery, in dreams, in static, or, in the sky, when no one else was looking. Others described it as a beacon, or a test, or even a judgment. One man in Johannesburg reported receiving a mental download of blueprints. When asked to draw them, he filled several pages with interlocking hexagons and spirals resembling nothing immediately recognizable. A linguist later pointed out that the shapes bore superficial similarity to certain Neolithic petroglyphs found in Turkey and Ireland. In New York, a popular podcast released a 5-hour special titled, "We Were Never Alone," combining speculative physics, ancient astronaut theory, and eyewitness interviews. It became the most downloaded audio episode of the year within 72 hours. Meanwhile, schools across multiple countries reported increased anxiety among students. Children asked questions teachers weren't prepared to answer. A group of 6th graders in Vancouver began a daily ritual of pointing mirrors at the sky to say hello. In Sweden, a middle school temporarily suspended classes after a group of teens initiated a mass silence campaign, claiming Earth was being listened to. The silence, however, did not extend to Earth's media engines. The reflective artifact had become a fixture, an evolving mythology co-authored by algorithms, audiences, and speculation. Every hour it went unexamined, it grew more powerful in meaning. By June 28, reports had reached the World Health Organization. In an internal memo labeled Information Adaptive Psychogenic Response, WHO analysts warned of a growing population segment exhibiting belief-motivated behavioral shifts, some benign, others potentially dangerous. While most episodes were isolated, the memo emphasized the risk of cumulative strain on public mental health systems. The memo closed with a single line, "The longer we wait for certainty, the more reality fragments." As June turned to July, it became clear that Earth's governments were no longer content to wait passively for the Vera Davenport's next scheduled observation. The silence from Kepler 438c, whether real or imagined, was not neutral. It was an open void into which ideologies began to pour. Old alliances strained, and new ones formed, not through treaties, but through statements, press briefings, and back-channel meetings. The first formal division emerged on July 1, when an international consortium of 12 nations, including the United States, Germany, Japan, and Australia, released a joint statement calling for a unified transparency protocol regarding all future extraterrestrial observation data. They advocated for the immediate publication of all raw and processed telescope imagery, arguing that the implications of the artifact extend beyond borders, and so must the data. Unofficially, this bloc came to be known as the Open Sky Alliance. Their stance was rooted in public access and rapid disclosure. The idea was simple: whatever the eye was, humanity should face it together. But not all nations agreed. Within days, a counter-alliance emerged, the Containment Accord, led by China, Russia, Iran, and several African and Southeast Asian nations. Their position was more conservative. They called for limited release of information, controlled through a centralized international body that could verify, redact, or delay sensitive data. The destabilization of global order, the Accord's statement read, is a greater immediate threat than an object 640 light-years away. Their fear was not unfounded. Markets had begun to behave erratically. Defense sectors saw speculative boosts. Gold and rare earth metals spiked. Several defense contractors announced new R&D programs citing interstellar signal resilience and high-altitude threat telemetry, terms that meant little, but implied everything. In Geneva, the United Nations attempted to broker a middle ground. A special task force, UNEXO, the United Nations Exo-Observational Panel, was convened with representatives from 27 countries, tasked with drafting a unified protocol for future contact scenarios. But by the second session, the cracks were visible. Delegates could not agree on definitions. Was the artifact a signal, an object, a structure? Did its potential threat require planetary security procedures? Could religious, ethical, or cultural frameworks be considered in the drafting of global policy? In the background, a third faction was rising, not a geopolitical bloc, but a philosophical one. Known informally as the Threshold Compact, it was composed of smaller nations, indigenous groups, and transnational NGOs who believed the discovery marked a civilizational threshold. Their position: humanity should pause, reflect, and make no assumptions, least of all technological ones. They called for a 5-year global moratorium on weaponization of space, AI-assisted signal interpretation, and any attempts to send messages outward until a full cultural impact assessment could be conducted. Their spokesperson, Adão Menendez, a sociologist from Uruguay, spoke at the UNEXO summit with clarity. If we assume this object is looking back, then our next actions are not just scientific, they are representative. We must decide, not as empires, but as a species, what it is we wish to say. His words were quoted widely. In editorials and classrooms, in policy meetings and protest signs. Yet no official body adopted the compact's proposal. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies operated on their own timelines. Satellite communications between several major powers showed increased encryption traffic. Leaked documents suggested that both the US and China had quietly repositioned space assets, ostensibly for observation calibration, though speculation abounded that these moves were designed to test rapid response capabilities in low orbit. Some feared escalation not with the artifact, but between each other. By July 4, the Open Sky Alliance had drafted a framework for a rapid response protocol in the event of artifact activity. They proposed live-streamed telescope feeds, real-time data decryption tools, and multilingual press briefings prepared in advance. In parallel, the Containment Accord began lobbying for the creation of a new international observatory, one controlled by a neutral AI governance board, a move critics immediately called digital censorship by design. And still, no new images had been taken. The Vera Davenport continued its schedule. The final observation over Titan was complete. The next window, unclaimed until recently, was now slotted for July 5, 2:12 Coordinated Universal Time. The world held its breath. On July 5 at 2 p.m. Coordinated Universal Time, the Vera Davenport Observatory once again shifted its gaze to Kepler 438c. The mission scheduler updated, and control rooms worldwide resumed their operations. The override application team, however, was focused on the task at hand, awaiting the first frames from Kepler 438c, 640 light-years away. When the image arrived, the data was clear. The planetary rotation had shifted Kepler 438c slightly since the May observation, but the reflective artifact remained visible. This confirmation, though anticipated, marked the last moment of normalcy humanity had. At 2:18 Coordinated Universal Time, a subtle but significant detail emerged. The angle of the artifact's reflection had changed, indicating movement. The object no longer reflected starlight in the same arc. It had moved, by 2 degrees. While this shift was monumental in the vastness of space, no conventional signs of motion, such as heat blooms or ion tails, were present. At 2:31 Coordinated Universal Time, another anomaly became evident. One of the artifact's edges, previously straight, now appeared curved. The change was precise and unmistakable, suggesting intentional design rather than natural erosion. By 2:55 Coordinated Universal Time, spectral readings confirmed no new materials or emissions. However, a dip in ambient reflection suggested that the artifact had reduced its visibility, possibly indicating awareness of its observation. At 3:10 Coordinated Universal Time, the images were approved for public release in compliance with the Open Sky Alliance's Transparency Agreement. The data would be made public within 2 hours. Simultaneously, internal escalation was initiated to Response Tier 3, and Emergency Protocol B was triggered, preparing for potential first response scenarios. The news cycle quickly reacted. The object moved. Visible changes recorded in structure on Kepler 438c. Scientists debate whether motion is signal or strategy. Markets fluctuated as speculative theories emerged, including suggestions of hidden communication, a countdown, or symbolic connections to ancient texts. In response, emergency meetings were held, satellites recalibrated, and emergency protocols activated. It began with a silence. For 6 days after the second observation, the artifact on Kepler 438c showed no further changes. No movement, no reshaping, no fluctuations in light. Just the same mirrored surface, the same impossible structure, the same curve cut along one edge like a warning drawn in geometry. The global response was less still. Countries intensified surveillance of their own skies. Observatories reported mysterious software malfunctions, most benign, some suspiciously timed. Open Sky Alliance nations pushed to accelerate the next observation window, while the Containment Accord quietly withdrew funding from shared satellite infrastructure, citing security realignment. And then came the signal. It was not transmitted to Earth, at least not in the traditional sense. No radio wave crossed the stars. No message traveled at the speed of light. What changed was not the artifact, but the space around it. On July 11 at 4:07 Coordinated Universal Time, the Vera Davenport detected a sudden drop in background cosmic microwave radiation across the field containing Kepler 438c. The drop lasted 16 minutes. The cosmic background, normally stable and uniform, had flickered, dimming by a factor too precise to be random. The effect was localized, like a lens briefly shading the starlight around the artifact. By 4:09, 5 observatories had independently confirmed the anomaly. By 4:10, the artifact brightened. The brightness spike was narrowband and pulsed, short, short, long. Short, long, repeating, not a beacon, not a code, not a message, not yet. But unnatural, intentional, and aimed not at Earth, but directly at the telescope. For the first time, the world was forced to confront a horrifyingly plausible possibility. It sees us seeing it. It knows how we're seeing. It is replying on our terms. Within 2 hours, headlines exploded. The object sends signal to humanity's telescope. A structured response detected from Kepler 438c. This is contact. Theories multiplied. Some believed it was proof of intelligence, others insisted on a natural phenomenon misunderstood by panicked scientists. But one fact became indisputable. The Vera Davenport had been targeted with a localized manipulation of background radiation, an act that could only be performed by a civilization with a mastery of physics far beyond Earth's. The implications were devastating, not for military balance, but for the collective human self-image. It wasn't that someone was out there. It was that someone had been watching long enough to understand our optics, our math, our curiosity, and chose to act only now. Factions within the Open Sky Alliance began to fracture. The United States, France, and South Korea formed an internal coalition pressing for a reply signal, a directed radio message, encoded with human logic. A greeting, a gesture, a test. Germany and India objected, citing the contact delay doctrine, which held that any action, no matter how scientific, could be perceived as aggression by a civilization whose intent was still unknown. Brazil, Kenya, and Canada advocated for silence, warning that response without understanding could be misread, or worse, answered in kind. Inside the containment accord, tensions boiled. A leak from a Russian official claimed that their own deep space array, the Saratov array, had received the same pattern of radiation pulses. The implication was chilling. The artifact wasn't responding to a single telescope. It was responding to all of them. And it knew where they all were. This shouldn't be possible. It takes light 640 years to reach Earth from Kepler 438c. On July 13, a decision was made. At 2200 Coordinated Universal Time, without prior announcement, the Vera Davenport began transmitting a coded light sequence toward Kepler 438c, a binary progression of prime numbers, followed by the atomic numbers of hydrogen, helium, and carbon. A message crafted not with words, but with universal constants. A signal that said, "We know you exist. We want to understand." The message took just under 4 minutes to broadcast. It would take 640 years to arrive. Unless they had already heard it. Unless they had been listening before it was even sent. Unless, in some way, they had already answered. The world held its breath. In churches and temples, people prayed. In bunkers, models were updated. In bedrooms, children asked what it meant to be seen from across the dark. And somewhere, in that fixed point of sky, a mirror had turned. The sky didn't fall. There were no invaders, no ships above the cities, no flash of impossible weapons or alien greetings. The artifact did not land, speak, or destroy. But the world still changed. It changed quietly. It began in the classrooms. Textbooks were updated. What had once been fringe theory, extraterrestrial intelligence as a probabilistic footnote, became foundational context. Children began their astronomy lessons not with our moon, but with the mirror on Kepler 438c. University courses adjusted, redrawing syllabi to include interstellar communication theory and telescope ethics. History had pivoted, not from a war or a landing, but from an image, a reflection that turned and turned back. Next came the realignments. The United Nations elevated the Office for Extraterrestrial Affairs, giving it direct voting power in the Security Council. An unprecedented data-sharing accord was signed by 93 countries, including longtime adversaries. The Containment Accord dissolved 3 days later, its members quietly folding into a broader, more public coalition. A new branch of physics, informally dubbed reactive cosmology, began to rise. Its focus, the behaviors of non-random deep space anomalies. It wasn't pseudoscience. It was funded. It was real. Surveys showed the shift in psychology was deeper still. A full 38% of adults in developed nations reported existential orientation disorder, a term coined by psychologists to describe the dissonance felt after accepting humanity's observer status in a wider cosmos. Not that someone might be out there, but that someone already knew. It wasn't just awe, it was reckoning. In the Middle East, 3 former rivals funded a joint observatory. In Nairobi, a new political party won parliamentary seats on a platform of post-contact transparency. In Florida, a startup launched the first commercial satellite whose only purpose was to look back toward Kepler 438c and broadcast its signal live, unfiltered, to anyone who wanted to watch. And people watched. The artifact never moved again. Not visibly, not demonstrably, but its image remained stable in every subsequent capture. It had changed shape. It had shifted light. It had altered a fundamental constant in our minds, that the night sky was passive. That to look outward was to peer into a past that could never look back. That illusion was gone. The telescope still operated, though now, every viewing request for Kepler 438c required a review panel and an ethical disclosure form. No one wanted to send another signal accidentally. Some wanted more. Some wanted silence. A few, quietly, wanted us to stop looking altogether. But it was too late. In a small observatory near the coast of Chile, a team of graduate students stared at a screen. Their scope was not the Vera Davenport, it was analog, old by current standards. But the star field they were watching was familiar. They weren't even pointing at Kepler 438c. Just near it, one student noticed something strange. A faint pulse, wide and slow, across the background stars. Not bright, not sharp, not aimed at Earth, but consistent. Another signal, not from the mirror, from somewhere else. There was no panic, not this time. But across the world, scientists reopened their notebooks. Engineers recalculated trajectories. Radio astronomers retuned their ears. People turned back to the sky, not to wonder if someone was watching, but to consider how many already were. The stars were no longer silent. And Earth was no longer alone. And the future had already begun.